I wholly agree that CBDC gives too much power to the state, and that's something that everyone should be concerned of, Republicans and Democrats alike. It's not something that you want, and it goes to the time-old adage of if you're concerned about the power, good. If you're not concerned, just imagine what happens when the other team is in power. There was a flurry of people saying we have to do this too because China's doing it. The benefit to proponents now is that the EU is generally not considered an authoritarian regime. And so they have a our friends are doing it argument. Because it's a liability of the Federal Reserve, in addition to creating these problems with runs, it's going to increase the cost of credit because banks can't use it as a source of funding to make loans. When officials are saying that the sovereignty is under fire and we need to launch something, it's our monopoly is under fire. We don't like that people are turning to something that serves them more. I don't often think about it this way, but money and our financial transactions reveals really who we are and what we do.
Morning, Nick.
Good morning, Bob. Thank you for
Thank
having me.
thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to talk about this topic that is such a charged topic in so far relatively small quarters of the world because a lot of people don't know what CBDCs are yet. And you are the closest thing to a complete expert that I could ever find. And I'm really impressed that you're undertaking the project of writing a book on it. Tell us about that and when that should be coming out.
Yeah, I should have hopefully, if all goes well, fingers crossed, I should have a book on CBDCs coming out either late spring or early summer this year, titled Digital Currency or Digital Control, Decoding CBDC and the Future of Money. And the goal of the book is to give people a one-stop shop to get familiar with what central bank digital currency or CBDC is in practice and why there are so many concerns about what it offers, namely the sheer lack of benefits for you or I and the really high costs to our freedom, to our privacy, to our markets, and much more. And that's what the book walks through, trying to give an entry-level tour of all the problems here in a way that doesn't require you to be an economist, an engineer, a politician, or anything else.
Well, the world needs this as soon as possible for, I think most people, once they understand exactly what it is, find it, the risks are significant. Tell me a little bit about how the CBDC movement, central bank digital currency movement, began. Because there was blockchain-based things for decades, then Bitcoin came along, then Ethereum and a handful of others. And during that whole time, governments weren't talking about any kind of a digital currency. Um, and so what's the way, how did it all unfold?
Looking back, it's a little unbelievable to see where we are now, that we're having this conversation, that it's something that comes up in the presidential campaign, that it's something that we see in headlines, because in 2016, 17, 18, it was mostly a niche issue. It was something that academics were thinking about, some central bankers were thinking about, but it wasn't a hot topic. It wasn't a real consideration. It was just a what if type of pondering. And what ended up happening was then all of a sudden in the summer of 2019, Facebook, now Meta, introduced the Libra white paper, the the proposal or the outlining of its planned cryptocurrency. And that really sent policymakers into a frenzy. They were worried it would jeopardize their stance on money. They were worried that it would introduce new competition into a realm that's been a monopoly for a long time. And they started to say, we need something. We need something to push back and stomp this out. And that idea ended up turning to, we need a central bank digital currency. We need a CBDC. And since then, you can see that the conversation has just skyrocketed. Anybody can go on Google Trends, for example. I always try to point this out. You can go on Google Trends, look at interest in CBDC, and you'll see right after the summer of 2019 is when it just skyrockets. And unfortunately, that really shows kind of the naked truth that this is an initiative to try to stomp out alternative money.
What, I guess we should define exactly what it is. What is a central bank digital currency? Because there, if people are thinking that electronically transmitted funds are the norm today, then what is it that distinguishes this central bank digital currency from normal central bank operations as we know it?
So a CBDC fundamentally is a digital national currency that is a direct liability of the Federal Reserve, like the cash in our wallets. That's also a liability of the Federal Reserve. But unlike that cash in our wallets, it doesn't have the privacy protections that cash provides due to its analog nature or the finality, in that it opens up a direct line between the central bank and people on the street so that they can see where the money is moving, and also they can have a hand in undoing transactions or halting transactions. And you're exactly right that here in 2024, digital currency does not sound like that much of an innovation, given we all use debit cards, credit cards, PayPal, Venmo, cryptocurrencies, and the like to make payments. But this is a very radical difference because we're talking about having that direct line between the government and citizens. That is really the radical change here, where there's long been this buffer or this air gap where private companies, whether they be banks, money transmitters, or the like, have operated. Now you're talking about replacing them with the government.
Libra was based on blockchain technology, as I remember, and that was something that distinguished its presence and its the invention that they were trying to create. And is the blockchain an important component of what a CBDC is supposed to be?
No, this is a misconception I see a lot, especially in the cryptocurrency community. People are excited that central banks might use blockchain technology, but they're really not. To their credit, um, central banks have investigated how blockchain technology might be used for a CBDC, but many of them have said, we looked into it and it doesn't make sense. For example, the Philippines recently put out a full report saying, we heard about blockchain technology, we were interested, we looked at it, and we're not going to use it. And the problem really is, we have this technology that helped decentralize the different pieces of the equation. And that's where it really shines as this great tool, decentralizing operations. But when we have a central bank operating, you have it pretty much with the epitome of centralization. So it's kind of the antithesis of it. It's the opposite of what it wants.
Well, in fact, it's called decentralization. So, and that is kind of one of the great ironies of all this is that the fact is the last thing that they would want is immutability because they want the power to be able to control things. And so the misconception that central bank digital currencies are some sort of a replication or they're leveraging the blockchain technology is just wrong, and is counterproductive to what central banks would actually ultimately want. And so if we look at the development of since Libra, I guess 2022 or 2023 was the year where all of a sudden 100 plus central banks all decided that this is something that they had to move towards. What triggered that tipping point, and where do we stand in that process now? And tell us a little bit about your CBDC tracker.
Well, it is pretty wild to see just how many have either pushed forward with full launches or pilot programs because more than anything else, it seems to be this race to the bottom where countries are seeing other countries doing it, so they have to do it. And this is something I've heard countless times for CBDC proponents trying to push for one in the United States. They say, look at everyone else doing it. We need to do it. Oh, someone else just did it. The race is picking up. And that's not the case at all. That is not how policy decisions should be made. And yet, here we are. Right now, the Human Rights Foundation CBDC tracker has about 11 countries and the 8 islands that compose the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union have launched CBDCs. 37 countries and Hong Kong have pilot programs, and then 65 countries, 2 currency unions, and Macau are researching CBDCs. So it's something that is spreading more and more across the world, and something that seems to be picking up steam in kind of all the worst ways, because as more are launched, we're seeing it pan out as being largely a failure in practice. But it's very difficult for central banks to let go of it because so many of them have staked their reputation, their credibility, their time, their money on having this be some panacea that it just can't be.
The it's that brings up a topic I was going to bring up later, and I think I will.
Okay.
Um, the idea that central banks are moving ahead quickly based on this threat of competition, don't want to be left out, all the other central banks are doing it, is either realistically or cynically can be viewed as cover for the political power and control that you get when you have a CBDC. Let's talk about that just for a second. What advantages for a centralized either central bank or government? What tools are wind up in the toolbox once you launch a CBDC?
Well, unfortunately, the only real limit is the creativity of policymakers, because we don't often think about it this way, but money and our financial transactions reveals really who we are and what we do. If you sit down with your bank statement and look at all the transactions you've made, you'll see the food you like, the places you visit, where you work, maybe the religious organizations you belong to, or the political groups that you belong to. You see all these threads that build up who you are, and it's you putting your money where your mouth is. It's showing who you truly are, in contrast to who you might portray yourself as on social media. And when you put all of that information directly in the hands of government, it opens the door to so many different abuses. For instance, governments might lock people out of the financial system because they are in the opposition party, or they might lock people out of the financial system because they hold controversial views. You can have programmable payments specifically with a CBDC, so that certain actions are not allowed, or certain preventative measures are taken. An example I often give is I've heard CBDC proponents say that parents could program it so that children can't spend their allowances on candy and other sweets. Well, a government could do much the same to limit alcohol purchases or try to curb other spending. For example, how would a federally provided money ever be used for cannabis purchases that have been legalized at the state level? And so you open up all these different layers, and the list just goes on and on and on about all the potential complications that might just not be considered at first glance, and outright abuses when you have government officials seeking to act on this information. And that's where, without any substantial benefit provided for you and I, it's really not worth taking these risks, taking the risk of having these abuses take place, because we've seen throughout history that governments will always want to amass more power. This is a clear line that should be drawn to say, no, this is not something we're going to move forward with.
Well, there are lots of examples of this having already occurred without the central bank digital currencies. For instance, Chokepoint 1.0 under the Obama administration, where they targeted some industries like payday lending and gun manufacturers or retailers. And in the latest iteration, Chokepoint 2.0, that Nick Carter made famous, they targeted the banking regulations around crypto, as well as other components that they had leverage over. But that was maneuvering a bureaucracy, and it took a lot of bureaucratic creativity to get that done. I suppose the real danger of a CBDC is all you need is one guy to lean over and click his keyboard a few times, and it's done. And so I think that's the main problem. Now, when you look at what the ECB has been talking about, because they seem to be very enthusiastic about introducing a CBDC in Europe, and that so far their investigation into it leads them to want a retail CBDC. And we'll talk about the difference between retail and wholesale in a minute, but they've made a big push for privacy as the number one priority. And yet my real question to those experts like you about CBDCs is, isn't this just a software? And that if you start a CBDC with a set of rules, that those rules could easily be changed over time? Political priorities or not, it could just be bureaucratic priorities.
Well, that is spot on. And that is one of my biggest concerns. But let me just be clear for 1 second. As much as they say that they are prioritizing privacy, it is not private in that your records are private from the government, because they're still going to require know your customer or KYC and AML or anti-money laundering requirements to identify who you are, where you work, where you live, and the like. But with that said, you're absolutely right that if we take the heroic assumption that the CBDC, when it's launched, perfect, is perfect on privacy, on protecting
Individual
freedom,
rights.
everything, all it takes is one horrible event, one awful event to change everything.
Yep.
I
Shift in
and
political priorities. Yeah.
And even then, it could even just be a significant shift in the powers that be, whether it be the administration or the members of here, Congress, Parliament there. Um, if you have enough of a shift there, then it can be changed over time as well. And it's really unfortunate that there can be a certain allure in getting it right and just limiting it from the onset. But that's again where I stress that point that there's no benefits being offered to us on the street that justify incurring these risks. And the risks do not go away just because they say, oh, okay, we promise not to do that. We promise we're not going to do anything bad with it. Unfortunately, the history of government surveillance has just been ever increasing, and the history of government control has been ever increasing. If if we're going to take them at their word, we got to look at the track record, and that does not suggest we should take them at their word.
No, that's right. In my mind, I think of this. There are two key characteristics of a CBDC that makes it impossible to have the advantages that people talk about with the old blockchain-based technology. And that is, one of them is that it's software, so it can be changed. And it doesn't matter how you start it, like we just talked about. And the other is that it is um, it's centralized by definition. And the whole idea of blockchain is that you get away from the reliance of trust of a third party to keep, as Lynn Alden says, the ledger. That
Yes.
there are decentralized, automated processes that monitor the ledger and verify its validity. And that in those two components make this completely unnecessary because they already have those characteristics. And you don't need a tool that will allow for immediate change at the whim of politicians or bureaucrats.
And that's,
Is that okay? Is that
yeah, and I was just about to say that's such a good point to stress, because even if we scale back a little bit from the blockchain perspective, I've also heard somewhat relatedly people say, well, if they just make it open source, that will solve it. That will protect us. And to that, your point is spot on, because they can make it open source and we can see the problems that are in it, but that doesn't mean we can change it. That doesn't mean we can stop them from doing these things or stop them from changing what it is and just publishing it again. A great example is the US code is available for anyone to go read through, and yet there are clear abuses of power in it. The Bank Secrecy Act is public and available for anyone to read, and it's what opens the door to financial surveillance in the modern era, and yet it's going on every day. It's
Yep.
happening every day unchanged.
And what we, generally we have seen that truths come out over time so that we can look back and say, wow, 4 years ago, they broke the law. They did not follow what this code was supposed to say. And you can't change it. It doesn't matter. And so and then they become emboldened and can continue to do that. And there are so many examples of that. Um,
Unfortunately, and that's why you're absolutely right that it's easy to get trapped with these with the siren song here, but it really is pulling us into the rocks, and it's really unfortunate. I hate that it has to be such a pessimistic viewpoint or perspective, but that is the reality of working with governments.
So last week, Chair Powell gave testimony in the Senate Banking and Committee. What's the rest of the name of it? The Banking
Oh
and,
gosh, it's
yeah,
I
it
always
doesn't
call it
matter.
the banking committee, but I think it's the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban
Yes,
Affairs.
that's exactly right. And Senator Kevin Kramer from, I believe, South Dakota, asked Chair Powell about CBDCs, and he used words that were very encouraging. Yesterday, I noticed a tweet by Tom Emmers. He said, if you think they're dismissing the CBDC, think again. And he attached the picture of a Fed document that had CBDCs as a major chapter. What was his testimony, and is this can we be encouraged that Chair Powell says that CBDCs are contrary to the founding principles of our country, as he alluded to the other day? And yet the Federal Reserve may still be pursuing the idea of a central bank digital currency.
I think so. Powell's testimony, when he said that the Fed is nowhere near launching a CBDC, and that they don't want to, or he doesn't want to see the Fed launch something to spy on Americans, was really good to hear. That's a great thing to hear, and people should be happy about that. I do want to caution people from being overly optimistic, though, because Powell has made somewhat similar remarks, not quite as strong, but somewhat similar remarks in the past. But I don't want people to think, oh, we don't need to do anything. The Fed does not have to have its authority constrained because they're not interested in pushing forward. It's not like with President Lagarde at the ECB. It's not like they're charging forward on this. And while it's true that he is not enthusiastic about it, we also have to be careful about what the Fed's authorities are. And when asked about that, he notably said that the Fed does not have the authority to launch a retail CBDC, but it's an open question about an intermediated or wholesale CBDC when he was asked in the spring of 2023. Now, fast forward to last week, after he made the comments about how he was not interested in having a surveillance tool launched by the Federal Reserve, he was then asked by Senator Cynthia Lummis again about his stance on CBDCs. And he added an extra note there saying that if they ever do it, they would do it as an intermediated CBDC. And so I think that people need to be cautious. They can be happy and celebrate this moment, but also be cautious that Powell is not going to be the chair of the Federal Reserve forever. And there may be a crisis just around the corner in the not too distant future that changes things dramatically. So it is really important that even with that, Congress still pushes forward and restrains the Federal Reserve and says clearly only Congress can authorize the creation of a CBDC in any form. It is not open to the Fed's decision making because things may shift in the future.
I suppose if Powell really believed this as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he could just shut down the project entirely.
Yes,
And
and there is that as well that we see pilots happening at all the not all, sorry, at many of the regional banks and research going on at the Federal Reserve Board, and it's still very much active in this space.
true. And then, of course, in once his term is up, the next person could easily come in with a different agenda, as you pointed out. Where do things stand in Congress? My read on the situation, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a large portion, probably a majority of people in Congress, both the House and the Senate, that don't know much about it and don't care much about it. That there is a very solid contingent of people, Republicans and Democrats, that are opposed to it, and that there is a significant portion of those that want to be very vocal about it. And on the other side, there are plenty of people that like the idea, and that there are very few people that are really trying to be loud about it. And that for now, the politics looks, if anything, difficult, which is probably why Chair Powell was able to say that.
Mhm.
Is that your read? And how about the difference between Congress and the administration in case they get another 4 years?
That very much is my read, and I'll give credit to Representative Emmer for pushing so much to raise awareness in the space because you're absolutely right that there are many members of Congress, and it seems to be increasing over time, that are speaking out against CBDCs, and those in favor have become quiet over time. The one point that I'll just add, though, is I do wonder what's going to happen after the election because we've seen this silence kind of be created as we lean in towards the election where Republicans are trying to take a stance against CBDCs, but Democrats aren't really taking a stance either way. And it makes me almost wonder if once the election is over, if it ends in their favor or not, they'll then show where they're really standing on this in mass, recognizing that right now the issue is, quite frankly, as Victoria Guida described it in Politico recently, politically toxic. It's become such a hot issue that if they do want to say something positive about it, it's not going to play well for them in the election. And the administration recognizes this too, because previously President Biden had issued an executive order that, amidst other things, placed the quote highest urgency on developing a CBDC. He brought on former Vice Chair Lael Brainerd from the Federal Reserve to be one of his top economic advisors. Brainerd had been the leading proponent of CBDCs at the Federal Reserve for probably 6 or 7 years at that point. And notably, when she was asked about CBDCs, I believe it was just a couple months ago, the White House said she had no position. There was no position at all, which again seems much more likely that they wanted to stay out of the conversation due to the political toxicity than really her having no position on something she campaigned for 7 years. Uh,
That's probably very wise. We have with Bitcoin ETFs having just launched with such evident popularity, it does seem dangerous to start trying to do anything that would oppose this movement without getting the quick read in November on just exactly how strongly it is everybody feeling this. And there will be a number of elections that where the whole idea of crypto, Bitcoin in particular, decentralized finance as a general concept will be put to the test. And I know that the crypto community is pretty optimistic that it's going to shift their way, but you never know with elections. I thought we'd pivot a little bit. I've done some work in this area, as you have, about what is it that the non-governmental people, like I understand why bureaucrats would want this power and be trying to get it. But what about the people who are not in power? People in Congress or outside folks who think this is a great idea? And I think we should probably start with Europe because they have probably one of the simplest, most appealing messages, which is the world of finance has invaded our territory, and we need to protect the sovereignty of our financial system. And that is why we must have a digital currency, a digital euro, so that we can maintain sovereign control over our money. And that is because payments companies and banks and the global financial system has imposed itself in Europe without very many European players involved. And the whole world of blockchain, where it's not only foreign companies, but now non-foreign entities that seem to also be chipping away at this concept of their own sovereignty. That is what the proponents in Europe are leaning into. How effective is this going to be? Do you have any insight into what's going on in the politics of Europe?
only limited, but I don't think that this is a winning strategy by any means for two reasons. First, it does sound good. It raises those patriotic feelings when we say that the sovereignty of our nation is under fire. But when we think about what that really means in practice, it's that the government is upset that people have found a better service. And it's hard for most people to think of money as something to compete with or to have a variety of choices with or to shop around for, but it very much is something that should be at the center of competition. And here, when officials are saying that the sovereignty is under fire and we need to launch something, it's our monopoly is under fire. We don't like that people are turning to something that serves them more. But the other side of this as well is that almost perversely, we've seen officials, especially in Europe, concerned about the decline of cash. The use of cash has been falling for many reasons because of the convenience of other services, because other services have provided a more enjoyable experience for people, but also because European governments have been restricting cash. all across Europe, you have different restrictions about how much cash you can spend over different amounts of time or how much cash you can spend in a single transaction. So I think it's a little disingenuous for policymakers to also say we need to launch this to make the national currency more popular when they themselves have made it less popular.
Excellent evidence of defending the monopoly, right? Let us
Yes.
damage our own stuff. Don't you come in and do it for us.
Yes.
Well, one of the proponents of what's very interesting is in House testimony that you were involved in also about CBDCs about 4 or 5 months ago. Professor Raul Carrillo spoke eloquently about the need for something to combat the centralization of all of the information in private companies that the government has access to. And he said, we already have surrendered all of our information. What we need is a government-sponsored tool to separate out and protect us against these companies. Very fascinating. So he was the proponent. And I thought it was fascinating that his whole idea was, it's already so bad, let's get the government to involved to compete. Now, his proposal is very interesting. It's very long, and it does contain the provisions that you can get one of these cards at a post office, and that the card contains no information, very, very little information. And so in that sense, it's protecting privacy. But my problem is that it keeps going back to this software base, that once the government is putting all these things out, they change their mind about what information they actually want to track.
Yeah, and an easy way that they can do that too is just roll out an updated card where you have to turn in your cards to get the Gen 2 chip installed, where they swap it out for free. But it's that easy to introduce changes, to introduce new elements to it that we really wouldn't have agreed to at the beginning. And that's why there is just such a fundamental problem with all of this. And to his credit, though, I'll say he's absolutely right that people do not realize how much, or rather how little financial privacy that we have in the modern era. As I mentioned before, things like the Bank Secrecy Act have given way to the government collecting our financial records. It's just that the private sector operates as this kind of air gap in between where governments have to go through them, go through different compliance standards to get that information. They most often ultimately get it, but it acts as a certain buffer. And instead, with a CBDC, we're talking about having that information by default with the government. And important to stress, while there are problems with data collection in the private sector, the the state has very much a monopoly on violence. The state is the only one that can lock you up, that can put you in jail under questionable charges, that can halt your life at an instant. There are problems that need to be fixed in the modern financial system, but I don't think we should make it worse for that.
Yeah, I think that that's the really important distinguishing characteristic is the government has force, and private companies don't. And private companies from time to time come out publicly and say the government's asking us for this information, and they benefit for their customers, on behalf of their customers. They stand up against it and bring attention to it. It serves as a modest and probably quite an effective break, but at least it's a break nonetheless. And it does allow for public disclosure of something in real time that you would never expect to see from the government itself. So one of the proponents is that they're already collecting all this information, and we talked about that. Another proponent, this might be a good time to talk about the difference between a wholesale and a retail CBDC, because a lot of the proponents, particularly in the United States, are very concerned about getting towards that retail CBDC and looking like they favor that for all the reasons we've discussed, particularly the surveillance and control aspect of it. The the what the wholesale CBDC is intended to do is just operate between a central bank and the banking sector. And I'm curious what benefits that would bring to anybody.
Not many,
And do I have
if
the
any
wholesale
at all.
definition correct?
Yeah. So just thinking about it as being restricted. So the separation is whether it's just for the banks or if it's just for individuals. And on the wholesale level, we're talking about a very small group of organizations that would have access to it. And so it's a CBDC limited to that group. But why we would need to reinvent the system to do that is just unclear. Um, to his credit, Chair Powell said that before Congress. He said, "Why we would need to do this, I'm not sure, because the system already is undergoing improvements, and there's not that many big obstacles there." Um, Whereas you have then the retail is reinventing the money that everyone operates, and that's where you have radical changes taking place.
One of the most interesting components of a retail CBDC is that it is a direct liability of the central bank, and therefore completely undermines the fractional reserve banking system. And I found this to be fascinating when I learned it, that in times of stress, the government fortifies the banking system so that they somewhat control who it is that's losing money when a bank has run into problems for some reason. Often it's credit related. But whatever the reason, they have the ability to fortify the system by either allowing that bank to fail or fortifying that bank or whatever the actions are that they decide to take. But in times of stress with the retail CBDC, why would anybody want to keep their money in a bank when I could just have a direct liability with the central bank? And therefore, in times of calm, why wouldn't people be shifting their money to the Federal Reserve as the ultimate safety net?
That is maybe one of the most in the weeds issues, but one of the biggest issues, and how they're going to solve this problem really isn't clear. You're absolutely right that there is this kind of trade-off taking place where it could very much undermine the banking system and lead to more crises in the future. And that is not exactly something that I expected to see the government effectively promoting, but it also has a unfortunate aspect of, because it's a liability of the Federal Reserve, in addition to creating these problems with runs, it's going to increase the cost of credit because banks can't use it as a source of funding to make loans. So you're talking about reducing the deposit base, reducing the supply of loanable funds. And that means, just from basic supply and demand, that the price of loans is going to go up for all of us. So that means it's going to be harder for us to get a car, start a small business, buy a home, or the like. And again, that's not something that we should want. That's the opposite direction that we should want the economy to be moving. And as I can't stop stressing, why are we incurring these costs when we don't have benefits to offset them? Every choice is about trade-offs, but this seems to be pretty weighted on the costs.
Well, it's funny watching the ECB publish papers and give speeches. This comes up at the bottom of their concern list that no problem, we have this under control because we're just going to limit the number of euros that every individual will be able to have in total CBDCs. Which,
And
you gotta
that's
scratch your head on that one too.
that's a
It's like
perfect example of how there's problems right out of the gate.
right out of the gate. So
Because
they have, they did one test of 3,000 euros, and they aren't sure whether that's the right number and that we've got lots of flexibility. It's quite amusing to someone who's watching a government trying to grapple with this. In Europe, it is remarkably difficult to find news stories and political interviews and think tanks that are weighing in on this problem or weighing in on the potential that a CBDC gets issued by the ECB. Um, and it just makes me worried that if Europe were to go ahead, the EU Parliament is going to be giving its final approval. It will happen sometime between late 24 and late 25. The rollout time could be as early as late 25, according to CBC documents. Um, and it's worrisome to me because if the ECB were to issue a digital euro, it would seem to give cover to everybody to be able to issue something, including our country. And so I'm worried about that. Do you think that that is also one of the more powerful levers that could affect the US?
yes, the second it happens, people are going to start running up to members of Congress, members of the administration, members of the Federal Reserve, and saying the EU is doing this. Why aren't we? Unfortunately, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality is very real, and it's something that's pushing people. We saw it with when China started moving forward. There was a flurry of people saying we have to do this too because China's doing it. The benefit to proponents now is that the EU is generally not considered an authoritarian regime, and so they have a our friends are doing it argument. But I think that is something that is going to be difficult to push back on because especially with people who don't know the risks of CBDCs, they're just going to see it as, oh yeah, they're doing it, so why don't we?
Mm.
And that's why it's so important to raise awareness about what's happening here. I mean, the majority of people, when the Cato Institute surveyed the American public, the majority of people said, "Oh, I don't know enough about CBDCs to really have an opinion." And I would imagine if they saw news that the EU was doing it, a good portion of them would say, "Oh yeah, it can't be that bad then." And unfortunately, it very much is that bad, and it's why we can't be led by that bandwagon effect. But again, that really requires raising a lot of awareness, which again, thank you for having me on this show because that's what it's all about, getting it out there so the public can know what's happening before it happens.
Yeah, it is really true. I think that um, it is the Chair Powell's comments, I do believe as encouraging as it was to hear them, I do think that it raises a much bigger risk of complacency. And you all did that opinion poll. It's also very hard to find any other opinion polls on it. And so keep up the good work. I hope you I hope you can do another one. I guess it's coming up on a year, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
do you plan to do it annually?
we are planning to do another one, just because we're not sure if we want to do it annually or staggered a little bit more. But we are planning to do another one because one of the really interesting insights from that poll was I said a moment ago that most people don't know what's going on. Um, but we also walked people through trying to be as balanced as possible, saying, here's what proponents say a CBDC will achieve. And list it out like it'll give you faster payments, it'll give you programmable payments, it'll give you lower fees and the like. Then we went through and said, this is what the critics say, that it'll jeopardize your financial freedom, it'll create financial surveillance, and so on. And one thing that was really interesting is when people got walked through both the claims from proponents and critics alike, people became more concerned. They began to have a very negative outlook on it, saying that if these benefits are true and these costs are true, the costs far outweigh the benefits. Frankly, I don't think the benefits are even true. But if we take that assumption, people said that, no, I don't want that. I do not want that created. And so I'm very interested to see over time if people start leaning more and more towards a negative perception of CBDCs as awareness rises. So whether it's going to be an annual or maybe biannual is still being hashed out, but it is something we want to repeat to get more information out there.
It was encouraging in the hearing, the House Financial Services Committee hearing on CBDCs, which I highly recommend people review. There were two Democrats that said different things that were very encouraging. One of them said, let me get this straight. If people use CBDCs, they will want to put their money into the central bank and take it out of banks, and that would undermine our fractional reserve banking system. Is that correct? And Professor Christine Skinner said, yes. And he said, well, then what problem do we have with other countries doing it? Europe, have at it. If you want to ruin your banking system, go for it. But us, no. And then the ranking member, whose name I'm forgetting, he's from California, he said, this sounds really great that whoever's in charge can control the money. And the last thing I want to do is let the other side have that control. So no way.
I want to give
And
some credit to him. I think that was Representative Brad Sherman
it
that said
was,
that.
that's right.
And I have to say, he has had some bombastic
Surprisingly.
opinions over the years, but that was a very interestingly nuanced position. He said that he doesn't like cryptocurrency because it gives too much power to the private sector. And for the same reason, he doesn't like central bank digital currency because it gives too much power to the public sector. And I've criticized Representative Sherman on his takes many times, but I'll give credit where it's due. That is a very interesting and nuanced position to take. And I wholly agree that CBDC gives too much power to the state, and that's something that everyone should be concerned of, Republicans and Democrats alike. It's not something that you want, and it goes to the time old adage of, if you're concerned about the power, good. If you're not concerned, just imagine what happens when the other team is in power.
Yep, that's it.
And that's when things quickly change.
So let's go down the road and assume that this movement can't be stopped. And let's look at what it's so evident to me, at least, that the government wins, people lose. So what is the uptake? So as we look around at some of the countries that have been quick out of the box, I assume that they have more need for control, Nigeria in particular. And what has been the reaction in the public? And should we extrapolate ahead and think that it would be very difficult for countries or governments to actually impose a CBDC if they launch them?
I think the consistent thread across all the CBDCs that have been launched is just a failure to encourage adoption, or a failure to get genuine adoption. We've seen even in China, for instance, um, where governments have given out money through like a lottery system. Uh, they try to get participants by saying, here's free money. You just have to create a CBDC account and use the CBDC. We've seen that in Jamaica, in the Eastern Caribbean, in the Bahamas, where they're trying to use these incentive programs. One of the biggest problems is that people just spend the money they got and then they never use the account again. They're not there's not a genuine need here. Like we said at the very beginning, digital currency is not an innovation of itself in and of itself in 2024. If it was 1995, we'd probably see a different story. But unfortunately, it goes a little beyond that because in the best case, it's a waste of money because no one's using it. But in the worst case, we're already seeing how governments are trying to not lose face, not lose credibility by forcing adoption. And as you mentioned, Nigeria really is an example of that taking place where adoption was at 0.5% in the country of I believe it's uh, uh, I might be off by a zero. It's either 200 million or 20 million, but you had adoption at 0.5%. And after some attempts to increase it through modest means, the government finally effectively engineered a cash shortage by pulling cash off the streets in a very quick timeline. And that resulted in riots in the streets, protests outside banks,
People
people
didn't
going
like that,
hungry.
huh?
People were
Go
upset,
figure.
and rightly so. And yet I can't believe the audacity of it, but central bank governor Godwin Emefiele said it was a success. The digital currency emerged as the currency of choice because it went from 0.5% adoption to 6% adoption. By forcing people to use it, he called it a success. And so it's really not a success anywhere. People just aren't interested in the idea. Sure, if you give them free money, they might use it for a little while, but it's not solving a problem that is core to people's lives. That is what is supposed to happen. And that is not happening here. And that's why, again, it's just a a really unfortunate situation to have governments latched on so deeply to an idea that really only introduces problems.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that that would be the course. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, we've seen just in the last week how they have, and I think it's related. They're doing what other countries that are more sophisticated, you would call it capital controls, but they're trying to shut down the ability for their own citizens to be able to um, move their money into different types of currencies, particularly cryptocurrencies. And it's likely that when you start messing with the money, you wind up with bigger political problems, would be my guess. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you described it perfectly. I would only add it's the same thing that you were mentioning about what's going on in Europe, where countries want to protect their sovereignty, but really what they're doing is stopping their citizens from accessing what they prefer, from what's serving them better. And in Nigeria, with the attempts to prohibit both explicitly and effectively the use of cryptocurrency, it's the same thing. The naira has a horrible track record of maintaining its value, so it should be no surprise that people are turning to alternatives, both uh, in cryptocurrency and foreign currency. And it's really unfortunate that the government is trying to trap them with the naira, whether it's digital, analog, or any other form.
Well, Nick, this has been fantastic. Where can I send people to see your work? And when the book comes out, we'll be sure to go out with letting everybody know it's available.
Well,
I look forward to
folks can
reading it.
find me on X at econ with Nick, and you can find me on cato.org. Just type Nick Anthony in the search bar, and you'll see everything I've written, and my book will be available on cato.org in the future as well.
That's awesome. And I'm going to put a bunch of show notes, links to a lot of different papers, both on the Euro CBDC as well as some testimony on when we post this. So
That sounds
hopefully
great.
people can
Thank
do
you.
work and we can send them in the right directions to know more and be active about it.
Yes. Yes, because that's going to make all the difference. And if nothing else, it'll at least help people know what's going on before they're forced to enter into this new regime.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this is a new technology. If they were to launch a CBDC, it's the perfect weapon for a government to use against its citizens, to completely
Yes.
controlling, monitoring and controlling how they spend their money. And so,
Yes.
and it's hard to say, it's hard to contain it. It's hard to say, okay, well, you can do it, but you can't, you can only do this and you can't do other things. It's not going to stay that way.
Unfortunately, I wish I could be that optimistic, but the history of government policies just it does not paint that picture.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't look good. Well, Nick, thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.